It's a nice day outside, and the cloud cover means I have pretty good light, so we're doing one of these outside. What are we talking about? Some years ago, back in the early 2010s, 2011, 2012, it was around the time of the Obama re-election campaign, two scholars, two men of Washington, two wizened gurus of the Beltway conventional wisdom, the kind of guys that if you asked them to show up on CNN or NBC or Meet the Press, they would give you a down-the-middle explanation of what was going on in American politics, of what was going on in Washington, non-ideological, perfectly balanced. About 10 or 11 years ago, these two men, Thomas Mann of the Brookings Institute and Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, published a book. That book was called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And it was about the polarization of American politics. I know, given the insanity of the current moment, it feels crazy that in the Obama era we were talking about hyperpolarization, but we were. It was very clear in that moment that polarization in American politics had gotten out of control, that the two parties had separated into starkly different ideological camps. But this book was interesting because unlike many of the other Beltway commentators who wrote and spoke about polarization, who affected a pox on both houses posture towards the question, Ornstein and Mann said something different. They disagreed with this. Looking at the past 30 years of American politics, they concluded that although Democrats had moved to the left, although they were more ideological than they had been in previous generations, the real transformation in American politics was with the Republican Party. They argued that the Republican Party had veered not just somewhat to the right, but wildly to the right, off the charts to the right. That the Republican Party was abandoning norms of reciprocity, abandoning norms of fair play, and embracing a hard-nosed, winner-takes-all, anything-goes form of politics in pursuit not just of winning an election, but delegitimizing their opposition. They looked to Newt Gingrich's time in Congress in the 1990s as one of the pioneers of this style of politics, and they brought the story into their present, where Senator Mitch McConnell, as minority leader, embarked on a campaign of unprecedented obstruction against the Democratic majority in Congress and President Obama. They looked at the Tea Party, treating it as an eruption of truly unusual partisanship and viciousness, aimed not so much at high taxes or anything like that, but on the character of the Democratic coalition, on the idea that these people weren't supposed to be in power. They looked at legislation, they looked at Supreme Court justices, they looked at the whole package of things that were happening in American politics, and they concluded that first, polarization was way worse than you think, hence the title, and that it was the Republican Party that was responsible. It was the Republican Party that had given up on any kind of consensus-based or cooperation-based governance in favor of a hardline ideological mode of governance that rejected even the possibility of the legitimacy of Democratic leaders and Democratic politicians in democratic governance. Uppercase D. It's no exaggeration to say that both Mann and Ornstein were kind of shunned for this take, because it really did cut against the conventional wisdom. It was not what people in Washington wanted to believe. They got some interviews on the usual shows, and they did a book tour, but the book was kind of ignored. I remember reading it back then. I was a wee boy of 24 or 25 and a grown adult. And I remember being very persuaded. I thought this was correct. This fit with my observations, not just of American politics as I had seen them, but really the past decade, going to back when I was a teenager, witnessing the Bush years, witnessing how all that transpired. And in the subsequent years since that book came out, it seems all the more prescient, all the more correct. Because yes, it is true, Democrats have moved further to the left, especially on issues of culture and identity, but increasingly on issues of economic management and the role of the state. There's a reason why the most exciting Democratic politician in the country right now is a young Democratic socialist in New York. Why Joe Biden, when he was president, happily worked with Bernie Sanders, an old Democratic socialist, to try to pursue his agenda. Why one of the other more exciting politicians, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is firmly identified with the Democratic left. People within the Democratic Party aren't afraid of the socialist label anymore. They're not afraid of proposing far-reaching, large-scale government programs. There's still fights to have about this, but the party on the whole, and people are going to not believe me when I say this, but just speaking as an observer, the party on the whole is considerably further to the left than it was 10 years ago, than it was 20 years ago. Note, I didn't say leftist, I just said further to the left. I want to make that clear. And so that's evident, but then it's worth looking at the other aspects of this, not just ideological positioning. The Democratic Party is still committed to free and fair elections. In 2021, Democratic majorities in the House and Senate attempted to pass a voting rights bill that, among other things, would have ended partisan gerrymandering and established a more equal basis for voting rights in the country. Democrats still understand themselves as representing the entire country. And so during that same presidency, a big applause point for President Biden was how much investment he's directed to conservative voting rural areas, almost to the neglect of liberal voting cities and other blue areas. Democrats don't talk about rural America as if it's a hive of dysfunction and corruption and slow growth and stagnation. They talk about rural America as if it's a place that they have to represent, as if these are people whose votes they want. And Democrats still talk about their Republican colleagues as their colleagues, as people engaged in a collective enterprise. The norms of Democratic, lowercase d, give and take are still alive and well within the Democratic Party, for better or for worse. Not so much in the Republican Party. And the trajectory of the GOP since that book came out has only demonstrated the truth of Ornstein and Mann's assessment. It hasn't just veered off to the right, and it has, so much so that the current Republican administration is actively trying to destroy huge swaths of the federal bureaucracy, rejecting things that have been consensus for years, except outside of the far right, efforts to destroy the Forest Service and sell off every public land they can get their hands on, efforts to destroy cancer research and medical research and technological research for reasons that are bizarre and opaque and only make sense to the most far right-wing members of the administration, and efforts to make it more difficult for ordinary Americans to have a say. Republican state legislatures across the country, either making it more difficult to have referenda or initiatives, or actively overturning those that are passed that aren't in their favor, actively working to gerrymander their states such that their political opposition simply cannot win representation. Engaging, and this is a quote from a ruling regarding North Carolina gerrymandering in the 2010s, engaging in the targeting of groups of voters like black voters with surgical precision to try to cut them out of any kind of majority electoral coalition. Attacking landmark legislation like the Voting Rights Act, attacking landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act. Both bills passed with Republican votes in the 1960s. You see, across the entire spectrum of issues, a Republican Party that really has rejected what has been the political mainstream for many decades, not in favor of something more egalitarian or equal or more effective, but in favor of the unvarnished domination of those that are wealthy and powerful. And then there's Donald Trump. First, Republicans nominated him 3 times for the presidency, and he won twice. Second, Trump has discarded with any notion of decorum in American politics, indulging gutter bigotry at every turn. And Trump rejects entirely the idea that his political opposition can legitimately win elections. His first term culminated in an attempted coup, January 6th, and it was an attempted coup. I won't listen to anyone who says otherwise. And he has spent his entire second term scheming, looking for ways to delegitimize his opposition, to find ways to hold on to power. And everyone who has any tiny bit of sophistication knows that when it comes time for him to leave, he's probably going to try not to. That isn't just veering far to the right for the Republican Party, which for the most part supported all of this. That's veering against American democracy itself, against this nation's traditions of self-government. Even now, though, despite the clear evidence that the Republican Party has gone far off the rails, such that it may even be a clear and present threat to the integrity of American democracy, there's still this temptation to take this pox on both houses posture. This, oh, I'm in the middle and I know both sides are wrong kind of deal. And I think that makes sense if you don't pay much attention to politics and you just are thinking about what you see on television, what you see maybe on your feed. But I think if you have any pretensions to being a serious or sophisticated observer of American politics, then that is, for lack of a better term, completely brain dead. The plain truth of the matter is that there is one party that is interested in preserving American democracy and seeing it move forward, and it isn't the Republican Party. Ironic, given the party's origins, and maybe we'll talk about that another time, but that's what it is. And on this channel, with these takes, one thing I'm consistently going to argue and point towards is that a large part of the problem facing the country just is the Republican Party, how it's currently constituted, what its incentives are, who its leaders are. That's what the historical record shows. That's what the current status of American politics shows. There's really no use in pretending that it's one way when I think we should all be able to see that it's very much the other way. Thanks as always for watching. If you enjoy these tranquil videos where I discuss all the things that are ruining the country right now, check out this one, sign up, subscribe, you know, the spiel, and come join this little community of politics observers. I'll see you next time.